I want to talk about the people that populate not only northern Africa but explicitly populate the modern country known as Egypt, and compare those people that live there now. It's common that when all of the History Channel and Discovery, there do so many pieces on Egypt, there's the implication. It's implied that the people that populate Egypt now were the very people who populated ancient Egypt. Speak to that, please.
Well, I mean, one could argue. I mean, it's a similar kind of situation in America. How could you argue that the people who populated ancient America are the people who populate America now? Because America has been subject to a large degree of immigration. Kemet agriculture was the agricultural breadbasket of the ancient world, even though it was a river in the middle of the desert. You understand? Didn't rain, none of that stuff. It was almost a 900-mile long oasis that flooded every year because of the millions of tons of topsoils that came down from the Ethiopian mountains, the Ethiopian highlands, Lake Tana, pushed the topsoils up the river, flooded every year like clockwork, made it so easy to do agriculture that they had time after the agriculture was to develop their minds, and they were protected in the middle of the desert. So these Africans created this civilization based on the observations of nature, and the observations of the world that ultimately lead to astronomy, to medicine, not just hocus pocus, but diagnostic medicine, surgery, herbal medicines, bone fractures, dentistry. All these things come right out of the Nile Valley civilizations. So this was a very attractive place in the ancient world. Imagine 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC, you have these huge giant pyramids, great temples being built, the best food in the world. People are making salads, man. They invented salad there. You understand? They have writing, they have linen clothes, they have doctors. Herodotus, the Greek Greek writer, sometimes called the father of history, in 450, 430 BC. He writes that the whole land is full of doctors, and there's a different doctor for every ailment. So here we have people who are established on the historical scene. It becomes a place of immigration.
But before you go to immigration, did Herodotus allude to what these people look like? Did he describe?
Oh yeah, Herodotus in book 2 of the histories, Herodotus says that the people of Colchis are descendants of the Egyptians because they have dark skin and woolly hair. Okay, now first of all, who's Colchis? Okay, what is Colchis? If you remember your ancient history, the first Greek writer is Homer. Homer writes in his book The Odyssey the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Okay, and they're looking for this golden fleece. And where is this golden fleece located? Colchis. Colchis is an area that's near the upper Mediterranean, I guess near Turkey, maybe modern Turkey, that area now. And in ancient times, I think it was Sesostris the first. I have to double check my notes on that. But who led armies from ancient Egypt there and populated. When armies stay in a place, their soldiers intermarry with the women and the rest. And so he's arguing, Herodotus in 450 BC, is arguing that the Colchians, you can tell that they're Egyptians because they're black people. It's like if I went to Philadelphia right now, and I went down to 12th and Vine, and I said, these people are descendants of the Chinese because they look like the Chinese. It's obvious. So in the ancient world, it was obvious that the Kemites were black. And the other thing is that all you have to do is look at their artifacts. They left literally millions of artifacts that said that they were African people. It's only later when this greatness of their civilization is appropriated, or the effort to make this something other than African comes as a result of many of the Egyptologists. And Sheikh Anta Diop wrote his The African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, in part to refute those early Egyptologists who made it a point to try to deny the Negro African origins as much as possible. And so when you look at the nature, the origins of the African people in Kemet, in ancient Kemet, what we see is this hugely attractive land, the center of agriculture, center of science, center of population, that because of its attractiveness and its location on the Mediterranean, after other civilizations get better and stronger and more capable in terms of their military, more capable in terms of their organization, they organize to try to conquer different parts. So you have the Persians' invasion of Kemet, followed by the Greek invasion, who later had the Roman invasion. The Roman Empire changes from the Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire because of Christianity, and so you find that these people all find and try to control Egypt, as they do. And then after the Romans, after the Byzantines, you have the Arab expansion as well. So for this entire period of time, this rich land in the middle of the desert is controlled by a lot of foreign people over time. And you have a very gradual change in the ethnicity of the population, particularly as you go to the north. Okay? And so, in fact, the Nubians, there's still many Nubians today. Nubians look just like other African peoples. And, the image that we get of Ethiopians. We tend to think that Ethiopians look like Haile Selassie, look like the Amharics. Ethiopians, man, Ethiopians has every type of black human being in the world represented in one country.
And you know what? I mean to jump in on you. One of the things that I have on my list that I want to get into, and we're going to get into it, no matter how many times we get together, I want you to talk about it.
Okay.
I want to do a piece on what I'm calling the faces of Africa, to
wonderful.
debunk the myth that people have in their minds of the African is the only type of African being dark skin, coarse hair, broad nose, thick lips like mine, and to get into all the different kinds of looks of Africans, because
that's true.
That's what Dr. Ben talked about when I interviewed him.
Dr. Ben his family's Ethiopian.
Right, he's an Ethiopian Jew.
He's an Ethiopian Jew. If you think about it, mankind starts in Africa. Remember how the two things that we have to get in order to understand Africa at all: size and ancientness. Okay? Size and ancientness. Mankind starts in Africa. And it moves all over this huge place. And then it moves to other parts of the world. So when it moves to other parts of the world, mankind adapts to those parts and they start to change physically. They have limited gene pools, small communities, limited gene pools, and they start to look like those people in that area. Why doesn't that happen within Africa? And the answer is it does. So you really do have different types of Africans, different physical types of Africans. And that's good. I mean, my experience is interesting, my personal experience. Because I always tell people I'm not the darkest brother in the room. And I'm from D.C. My father's your color. I look like my mother. A lot of black people have these genetic, variety within their families. And we tend to think that this is the white man who did this because he raped our parents. In reality, when I went to West Africa, I lived there for about 6 years. My oldest daughter was born in Ghana. I met her mother in Sierra Leone, and I went there. People would, after I lost some of my Americanness, when I say the Americanness, we have this absolutely negative image of Africa in our hearts. So I've seen brothers and sisters go over there and the people come up to them and say, I can't touch this person, I can't eat this. And these people are healthy and they're very good people. And I lost that sense of we are better than you, when I went over there, because we're not. Racism, we're all African. That's right. We take on the European-centered racism relating to Africa. So I lost that stuff. After a while, I just lost all of it. People would come up to me from the States and they would think I was a Ghanaian. And Ghanaians are generally darker than me. Just because it's the spirit of that negativity is gone. People in Mali would come up to me and talk to me in Bambara or Fulani because I look like a Fulani man. That's who I look like. I look like a number of Bambars. I could live there and you know, if speaking the language, no one would ever know that I am not an African just as much as any African on the face of the world. And that's what I learned. That's the lesson that I learned in Africa.
I want to go back though. I want to go back to Egypt because
Okay.
I want to be able to make the distinction based on historical fact, no revision, on the transformation of Egypt going back to the most ancient days of Egypt and all of its dynasties, and when the Hyksos, their efforts to come in, and when the Greeks finally came in I think around 332 BC, if my recollection, if I have the facts right,
okay.
and then on into the Arabs and on the 7th century.
But okay, look at the time frame we're talking about.
Okay.
See, that's the point. The point is, okay, if you wanted to say these people here, the Americans, have been here, you know, and they were the original Americans, of course they're not. Original Americans didn't look like them. Okay, and it's because they immigrated, you know, and to some degree, and to a large degree in this country, colonized. But Kemet is a place where a lot of immigration took place over a long period of time. Now, how long is this period of time? Our sense of history is skewed in this country. We tend to think history in terms of 10, 20, 30-year periods. Not so in ancient history, not so in the world history. World history is measured sometimes in clumps of 400 and 500 years. Some of the dynasties that we talk about were like 400 years long. You know, our own sense of history doesn't put anything there. You know, England has had a dynasty only 1,000 years. Okay, you understand? Before the Romans came into Europe, they were the barbarians. They were the Gauls, the Visigoths, the Goths. You understand? Their nations had not been conceptualized. So that's a period, that's only a couple thousand years. Kemet has a history that's 5,000 years long. It's not like the other places in the world. It has a much, much longer history. So you find that the Hyksos, if you want to bring that, the Hyksos were like undefined group of people for a couple hundred years. You know, mostly in the northern part, near the delta, in the south, you know, in the delta area and a little south of the delta. But Kemet is like this place where you got this great big huge delta that would fit from Philadelphia to New York and cover everything in between.
Let me put it to you this way. There are some scholars, Eurocentric scholars primarily, that would argue that Egypt was a multicultural society. They'll own up to of it being black, but only insofar as it being a multicultural society. At what point is there any Greek or European influx into Egypt?
Oh yeah, I mean there was a bit of Persian influx there. You find what happens. It's so different than we think. We think that the way that we see our history now is that Europeans have come into these various parts of the world and changed them and Europeanized them. Okay, and that's the way we see, for example, the American history. This place is now a European style place. South America has similar dynamics. In ancient Kemet was more attractive than their own countries to them. You see what I'm saying? And so when the Greeks, for example, came into Kemet, they didn't suddenly make everything Greek. They did some things with language. They imitated and they emulated the Kemites. They started wearing Kemetic clothes, speaking the language, intermarrying with the Kemetic leaders, creating the Ptolemaic dynasty there. And there were other projects where the wealth that they accumulated there made possible, like the Library of Alexandria, and places like that. But their own sense of it was that they were not making Kemet Greek. They were, in essence, making the Kemetic culture, making Greece subject to the Kemetic culture. A lot of times when we look at Sheikh Anta Diop's two-cradle theory, for example, and I know you've talked about this with a number of scholars before, You look at the northern cradle and the southern cradle. Some people would argue that the northern cradle is Europe and that the southern cradle is Africa and those places. But I don't think that's what he's saying at all. I think what he's saying is that there's a northern cradle, southern cradle, and zone of confluence. And the zones of confluence, really most of the Mediterranean is the zone of confluence. So that the Kemetic influence on Kemet is stronger than the I said the Kemetic influence on Kemet. The Kemetic influence on Rome is stronger than the Roman influence on Kemet. The Kemetic influence on Greece is stronger than the Greek influence on Kemet. Although they controlled, or they colonized that.
At some point, we've got to be able to say to those people who turn on television and have no idea what he's talking about, Kemetic or Kemet, they haven't a clue that what you're referring to when you say Kemet or Kemetic. You're talking about Egypt, what's commonly referred to as Egypt.
Ancient Egypt.
Right.
Ancient Egypt.
Right.
So the influence of ancient Egypt, of Kemet, on the Greeks was more profound than the Greek influence on ancient Kemet. In other words, I mean, look at who we are. See, what we don't understand is the contributions that these Africans made to the world that we still use today. Okay, what's your sign? What is your sign?
My astrological sign?
Your astrological sign. You're a Virgo. Okay, do you know you're a Virgo because of ancient Kemet? The signs that we had, the calendar that we have, they invented the calendar. There's 365.25 days. Not a leap year every 4 days, but it was a precise measurement of the sky. Our entire sense of time is based on the sky. The sun goes from here to here and then comes up again. We call that a day. You know, the sun moves to the day becomes long in this part of the season, and another part we call it seasons. You know, all of these are based on precise measurements of the sky. And the thing to note is the equinox, when the day and the night are actually equal. All of that, those measurements were made in Egypt and they created the calendars that we have and the signs that relate to the calendars and the math that relates to the calculation of these round devices. In other words, their year was 360 days. 360 is what? The circle. And it's because of the circle. And then they added the other days for festival days because that's really what happened. We tend to not understand that these fundamental signs, Libra is where the days are balanced and the equinoxes. Leo is when the lions came closer to settlements because it was a dry season. The flood season, you find Aquarius, you find, what's the other one in the flood season? Is it Cancer? There's another, Gemini, you know, is when the twins, goats are born. Sagittarius, all of these are physically found in the artifacts of ancient Kemet. Their signs, their references, their times in the sky, what they represent, all is a part of African knowledge, systems of African knowledge development. So that when the Greeks come to this place, they don't know medicine. And Herodotus is saying, dang, man, they got doctors for the eye here and a doctor for the foot. And they specialize in a doctor for the teeth. We call them dentists and podiatrists and, you know, ophthalmologists. You know, but they had those kinds of levels of scientific specialty. They had scientists who understood mathematics. They invented pi, you know, the sign for the circumference, for the formula. They invented these sciences, and the artifacts that proved that all these things were there prior to the Greeks or anybody else coming on the historical scene with any comparable knowledge. And there are also evidences that prove that these people were Africans at the same time, including their own artifacts, how they depicted themselves. Look at Tutankhamun in the 18th dynasty. This is a brother. You could take gold paint, put it on a school kid in Philly, and he looked just like Tutankhamun. But the new exhibit that's coming, they try so hard to not make these Africans, and that's part of the legacy, the racist legacy of early Egyptology that Sheikh Anta Diop critiques in the African origins of the African origins of civilization, myth or reality. And so when you go to these places and you look at the Greeks get their gods. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, anybody who writes, about these areas, and African-centered writers in particular, point out that the Greeks got the names and the characteristics, the qualities of their god from the Kemites. How do you do that? How do you get the names of your gods from another people? These people had it better. And they said, wow, what is this called? They're saying this to the Egyptians. Look at Atlantis. What is Atlantis? Atlantis comes out of Kemet. Atlantis was, and this again, Sheikh Anta Diop does a wonderful job in Civilization or Barbarism. He has a small chapter about the Atlantis myth. The Kemites, the ancient Egyptians, told the Greeks, they said, your ancestors come from Atlantis, which was destroyed, and then they moved from Atlantis to Greece. This is what the Egyptians told the Greeks. And so what is Atlantis? There was this island in the Mediterranean called Santorini that exploded in about 1450 BC. And that was the Atlantis. That exploded, and it created a lot of things in the middle of the 18th dynasty. It creates a sense of change of religion. It leads to Akhenaten in some ways. In Kemet, Akhenaten leads to Moses. Moses leads to the Hebrew thing, which leads to the Bible. All of this, and Tutankhamun, all these guys were in the same place. And so we're looking at this integration of all these historical dynamics coming out of and being centered in Egypt. This was still 700 years before the Greeks.
You mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop a couple of times. I'd like to talk to you. I'd like for you to talk about his legacy a little.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sheikh, I never had the opportunity to meet the brother. I wish I had, but through the grace of Allah, I did not get that. Sheikh Anta Diop was one of the treasures of black scholarship. We have to fight for a knowledge of self. If we're not careful and we just listen to what the media, which has this huge legacy of racist representation, if we have to wait for them to tell us who we are, we will never ever get it. We will always have negative images of ourselves, negative images of Africa, negative images of black history. And we don't need to do that because the historical records themselves are full of positive images of black history. Sheikh Anta Diop was one of the people who challenged the very central authors of this type of mythos of non-African history, of non-positive African history. He challenged the early Egyptologists, and he said, well, I can prove to you that these pharaohs and these other dignitaries were in fact African people simply by testing the melanin in their skin. And he was the director of the Radiocarbon Dating Institute in Senegal, which was IFAN, which was one of the early academic institutions. And his whole life, he challenged the racist perspective of Eurocentric knowledge construction of ancient Africa. His scholarship was so significant that when he passed, that the University of Dakar changed its name to Sheikh Anta Diop University. And his scholarship, and I really would recommend reading his works. He talks about how, as he talks and gets into more than ancient subjects, how there's a cultural unity of black Africa, and that this cultural unity actually makes a great difference in terms of understanding what the potential of Africa is. He points out that West Africa, which we've talked about, has the greatest hydroelectric potential in the world. There's hope for African peoples. There's hope for us, because once we understand who we are and what we have, we can actually use that to construct positive projects, positive major types of infrastructure developments, immigration to Africa. We can do all of that and create a basis for the development of African peoples that is based on reality. We talk about the resources of Africa all the time. In reality, see, knowledge is political, and we have to know who we are in order to own the unity which we all say we need.
Talk about that a little bit more. That's a fact. I've never heard that said before, even though it's a reality. Talk about the politics of knowledge.
Okay, the politics of what is it? I mean, see, I believe, and I strongly believe that we don't know what we don't know due to the politics of knowledge. I'll give you an example. Okay, we're from a similar generation, right? You and I come from, we're old heads.
Right.
Okay, let's just put that right. We learned in the 70s, all of us and many thousands of people out there picked up books and started reading, and we all got this outline of African history, primarily based on Leo Hansberry's argument, which we talked about a little while ago too, Chuck. We got this argument that African history was about kings and queens and the rest of that kind of thing, and people would walk around saying, we were kings and queens. In reality, that's not a strong enough basis to create the unity, because we all weren't kings and queens. And if everybody's walking around with this mindset where they think they're going to be in charge, then they're missing the boat about what it takes for African unity, for black unity to take place. We need to work together on the various levels that we work. We need doctors and we need mechanics. We need printers and we need seamsters. We need, people at all the different levels to work together in order to have some real practical African unity and black unity. And so the politics of knowledge were constructed to make us think of it, in Eurocentric construction of history. You basically had this hierarchy. At the top you have the leaders, the elites, and at the bottom you have the masses. Okay, so and the history becomes not the history of the masses, it becomes history of the elites. So that you have, the kings of Europe, and you say World War I was started because of, this chancellor being shot in Germany, and the politics of the elites made that possible. And they say that, I'll give you another example, that colonialism or slavery was made possible because of the popes and the elites in the church saying, yes, you can go ahead and do this. In reality, that's not what made that whole process happen. What made it happen was that the small profits being made that become big profits when shipbuilders, sail makers, staffers, woodworkers, people who make the boats, people who start to do these small plantations, getting more and more profit out of them slowly until the thing is so doggone profitable, everybody wants a piece of it. The politics of knowledge have us looking at the elites as the makers of history. And they did the same thing to us in Africa. They wanted us to think the only history of Africa was the history of the empires. So we know about Mansa Musa. We all know about Mansa Musa, but we don't know a damn thing about Mali. We don't know about rice. But we know about Mansa Musa. We don't know about horses. We don't know Africans rode horses. We don't know that. I challenge you. Find people who think that they've been reading African history, black history all their life. See if they know that at all. You understand?
Here's where I wanted you to really, and that's good stuff. Where I wanted you to go at was, for example, if you talk about philosophy, you're talking about Socrates and Plato. If you're talking about music or the classic, so-called classic music, you're talking about Beethoven and Bach. If you're, so in other words, the very beginnings or construction of knowledge is such that when you talk about those types of things, you're invariably talking about a European icon. You're starting in Europe, or you're starting in Greece.
Right,
Rome.
It's designed that way. That's why it's called Eurocentric. Eurocentric takes Europe as the center and the fount of these various areas of knowledge, and whether they came from them or not, they still try to claim the knowledge of that. Look at Elvis Presley, man. Elvis Presley takes Otis Blackwell's music, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel. I mean, this is like clear, and suddenly he takes it and makes it his, makes lots of money, becomes an icon in the culture, and 99.9% of the people would never doubt that this is his stuff, this is his spirit coming out in the music. And it's not. It's a copy of Otis Blackwell, but it's done his way, but it's still imitating. And so you find this to be true of philosophy, of Greek philosophy. You look at the book Stolen Legacy. George G.M. James, in his publication in the 50s, he was an Arkansas, I think it was A&M scholar, but when he wrote Stolen Legacy, he pointed out that the Greeks studied in Kemet. Listen, my point is, and hear this, this place, this river in the desert, was the bomb. People came there and they learned. Okay, this is where they came to learn. And it was an African place. And they didn't mind saying, because they recognized that this was what it was.
Let me ask you something, because, and this is purely my analysis,
Okay.
not anything I read or was told or anything like that, is that, and it's something I'm very interested in, and that is the whole concept of racial stratification, and more accurately, racial hierarchy. Mm-hmm. It's my view, based upon what I've learned from reading Herodotus and the interface between the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, and when these cultures came together, they did not see race or racial hierarchy as we see it today. Okay. Can you
sure.
expound on
I mean, it's true. What you're saying is absolutely true. The whole idea of racism came about in large part to justify the enslavement of Africans. Prior to that period, especially prior to the 1700s, I'm not even talking 1600s, prior to, and you've read J. Rogers. J. Rogers is wonderful. Most people don't read him anymore, but if you read J. A. Rogers, Sex and Race, or any of those things, you realize that the whole ethnicity piece is completely different in the ancient world than it is in the modern world. But what you have is an effort made by, see, there are a couple of things going on at the same time. Most of us don't realize as well that the university, the structure that intellectually justifies the various fields of knowledge, that bases some of these, is relatively new. Most of us think the universities go way back into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. No, they don't. Most university disciplines are about 100, 120 years old. There was no political science being taught in universities 200 years ago. There was no sociology. The very first American serious history department publication was the Harvard Historical Review. You find the first history departments in German universities in the 1860s, Göttingen and in places like that. And these particular institutions form the core teachings of what each discipline is going to teach within the university. So you have that when sociology is formed, they follow the Chicago school. You find history following German ideas. One very good resource to understand and break all this stuff down so that you understand the history of the university is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois comes in at the beginning of a lot of these disciplines. There was no sociology, for example, and he's considered a pioneer sociologist. So you find that these so-called scholarly groups, the anthropologists and the rest, develop at the same time that racism is at its height. So they justify, and they try to justify this concept of race and the hierarchy of race and Darwin's, post-Darwin's, theory of selective breeding and those kinds of things, and they all try to put all of that in the context of how the world is, what is knowledge. So if you become an anthropologist, and especially in the early times, you studied everybody except Europeans. If you become a historian, you study the Greeks and the arguments. In fact, Bernal's Black Athena is a wonderful critique, Martin Bernal, is a wonderful critique of how the idea of classical Greece and classical studies becomes a part of the university life in the university system, the university construction of knowledge. It wasn't like that prior to the university construction, and that's what he talks about. So that you find that the intellectual justification, or the so-called, scientific justifications for racism, accompany the height of accompany the height of racism. So you see that this whole idea of Eurocentrism, the whole idea of race, is really part and parcel with the oppression of African peoples, rather than the reference to the history. The Greeks, didn't see black people like the modern whites see black people. The Romans didn't either. Neither did the ancient Asians. And this whole idea of race and racial superiority comes at a much later period in history.
Man, what period does it show up?
Again, all of these things are gradual. They're not something that you say, okay, in 1246 it showed up. No, it doesn't work like that. It showed up over the period from, say, the late 1600s to the early 1800s is where it really shows up. Prior to that, and you'll see this in J. Rogers' Sex and Race, Africans were prominent in many parts of Europe. You had large numbers of Africans there. The Japanese say you can't be a samurai unless you have some black blood. There's a lot of these different regions of the world where African ancestry and Africanness is not a negative thing. The so-called Arabs, were very African, up until not that long ago, up until the point in which the Ottoman Empire brings more immigrants of a lighter complexion and different physical type into the areas of Egypt, Kemet, and North Africa. So you find that the whole idea of race and racism is very different in the early periods of history. It's not the same at all.
Speaking of which, that's a natural parallel or transition into the ancient Israelites, for example. One of the things that I find common amongst Americans in particular is that when we think of Jewry, Jews, we think of European Jews.
Right.
But there are all kinds of Jews, people who practice Judaism.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the ancient roots of Judaism?
Sure. Sure. Two things have to come out. First of all, where the white Jews come from, where the European Jews come from. The Jewish people, as we know, were through a series of invasions that the Bible documents, actually, the Babylonian invasion, the Persian invasion, the Roman, invasion, just like Kemet. You understand? This is a place that's right next door to Kemet. These people that are invading aren't really interested in Israel. They're interested in Kemet. Okay, and they're trying to get to Kemet. Israel just happens to be right next door, a little place next door to Kemet. So when you find the various dispersions taking place, they're really related to Kemet, but they do affect the ancient Jews as well. So when these people are scattered in different parts of the world, not a lot of people, they form isolated communities. Many of them maintain religious traditions, but in one place in the world, the Khazar Empire, from about 700 AD to 1013 AD, that is about 1,300 years ago to 1,000 years ago. One of the Central European monarchs embraces Judaism, and he invites some of these spread out Jews. This is the same time that Islam is growing. It's very interesting. We know about the spread of Islam, but we really don't know about the Khazar Empire. So he invites the Jewish refugees from various parts of this area, from the Fertile Crescent, from the Mesopotamia area, from what was Babylon, from the parts of Spain and from parts of Europe where they were, and they converge in this particular region, which is Central Europe, which is now Poland, Czechoslovakia, those regions of the world, and they form the largest Jewish state in history, called the Khazar Empire. And the Khazar Empire is where European Jews came from. The Jewish people integrated physically. They intermarried with the people that they lived with. There's an interesting book that I once found called Jews in Old China. And in this book they depict the Jewish people in China, and they're Chinese looking. They're Chinese, physical Chinese, maybe with slight variations, but essentially Chinese looking. And this showed me, and other people have talked about it, that the Jewish people as traders intermarried and intermixed with almost all the people that they lived with. So when the Khazars invited the Jewish immigrants from various parts, they intermarried deeply with the Europeans and became the seed, the genetic seed, if you will, of the European Jews. The language that they spoke in the Khazar Empire was Yiddish. Okay. And this is the same Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, that the Nazi Holocaust, and that's another conversation, came from. Okay, so that's the first question. Okay, where do the European Jews come from? And then from there, they migrate to the United States and et cetera, and Israel is formed in the 49, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So that's where they come from. So the image that we have of them comes from the mediated image of Jewish history and of biblical history, which is not, the mediated image was first of all appropriated by Europeans who wanted to say that all of this area that they get their culture from, remember the zones of confluence, that they get their culture from, that these areas were theirs, that they were Europeans. And so suddenly, as they control the media more, new media becomes involved. There was no movies in 1900. There was no cars, few cars, no popular cars. There were no radios, no televisions, none of that stuff. So when those things come into being as transmitters of popular culture, they seize upon this with a racist ideology to project images of their history that is different than the real history, and they project the Bible, for example, as a white European project, and in reality, their own records. I mean, when you look at the icons that are considered holy in Russia and all of the Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox, all these Orthodox churches have these long-standing traditions, and in these traditions they depict peoples in the Bible as black. You find among some of the greatest artifacts of the ancient world depictions of black Marys and Jesus, and you find, for example, at the foot of Mount Sinai, there was this monastery built by Catherine, who was the mother of Constantine, the Roman emperor, who embraced the first Roman emperor who embraced Christianity, and who became the conquering Roman that brought Romanized Christianity to the Mediterranean world. And Constantine's mother built these particular monuments all over the place that were considered at the places of sacred places. And there's this one, I'll show you a picture of it, where you have at the foot of Mount Sinai a monastery that is built by her. And in this monastery there's this huge tapestry. And on one side you have Catherine, the mother of Constantine, and as a European, and then you have Mary and Jesus in the middle as black people. You find literally thousands of sites where the Black Madonnas were. Ian Begg has a good sort of survey that's called The Cult of the Black Virgin. And in it he points out all these Black Madonna sites all over Europe and North Africa, 300 in France alone. The whole idea that the early Christians depicted Adam and Eve and Jesus the Good Shepherd as black people comes from their understanding of this tradition of Africans being central in the Bible story, of black people being central in the Bible story. Now the question is, how is that so? Let's take a look at the Bible. The Bible itself gives us an ethnic code, if you will, in its Genesis table of nations. That's Genesis 10:20, and in it it says that Noah, their story is, the Bible is the story of a group of people. Okay, and first of all, a clan, if you will, several tribes, an ethnic group, and every ethnic group that I'm aware of has its deeper traditions, its deeper narratives, has a story of creation in which they're the created people. The Yoruba, have a story of their created people. The Shona, the Kemites, all have this narrative of creation. And the Hebrew people have this narrative of creation where you have Adam being created as the first person. if you take their chronology and, let's look at the current Jewish year, you'll see that it's only about 9,000 years old, and we know people were there before that. But anyway, their story suggests that there was this great flood, and this flood destroyed the world, probably their world. And their world was most likely at the origins of their culture between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In fact, Abraham was born in Ur, in the Chaldees, which I believe today, what country would that be in?
Iraq, I believe.
Is it Iraq, or is it not Turkey? Where the war started, because the Kuwait, not Kuwait.
No.
Is it Kuwait? Maybe. I think it might be Kuwait. I forget the small country, really small country it might have been Kuwait. Okay, but right there at the tip of where the Tigris and Euphrates join. Okay, and so there's this flood, and the flood destroys everybody in the world except for whom? Noah. Noah has 3 sons, but these 3 sons have unusual characteristics because they're also color names. You have Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham means dark, Shem means reddish, and Japheth means white colored or light colored. So you have this sort of color coding within this group. And I believe, and many other scholars believe, that this is a way that they saw how the colors, the ethnicity of the world evolved. And they said, see, these people are descendants of Ham because they were black people. These people are descendants of Shem because they were reddish, not black, and not white people as well, different kinds of colors. And the Shemites include the Israelites. Abraham is a Shemite. Now they're called Semites. So we're talking about the ancient Jews, ancient Arabs as well. They're calling the people who migrated into these areas from that area. Notice we're talking about migration again. Okay, we talked about in those areas, Shemites and Israelites and Ishmaelites both becoming Semites, representing the Semitic branch. But who are the Hamites? Ham was the dark one. Ham's sons had 4 sons: Cush, Canaan, Phut, and Mitzrayim. Cush means black. Okay, so Cush has a son whose name is Nimrod. Nimrod founds the cities of Babylon. You understand? Mitzrayim means children of the sun. Ra is the sun. Ra is the sun in Kemet. Re is what we call the force that emanates from the sun. You see, same word. Very same word. Hasn't changed in all these thousands of years. So they call one of the sons of Ham Mitzrayim, which means children of the sun. Guess who the children of the sun are in the Bible? The Egyptians. Every Egyptian is called a Mitzrayim. In the Arabic tongue, the sister brother language of the Hebrew tongue, the Semitic tongue, Egypt, which is an Arabic-speaking country now, is still called Al-Misra.
And what does Egypt? Egypt is a.
Aegyptos was a Greek term, coming from the Coptos, from the same religious background, but it's not the same as what I'm talking about now. Wait. Let me finish this one. Okay, because you got Ham's sons, Cush, meaning black, founding Babylon, and then you see Cush down in past Nubia. Then you got Canaan, Phut, and Mitzrayim. Okay, Mitzrayim, children of the sun, all the Kemites, all the ancient Egyptians are called children of the sun in the Bible. Okay, then you have the Canaanites. Where does the Bible take place? The Bible is the story about how the followers of Moses, the children of Israel, and the ones they integrated with, just like they integrated in Europe to make European Jews, they integrated in Africa, in Kemet, up to the time of Moses, who thought he was a royal member of the 18th dynasty. Hello, the dynasty of Tutankhamun, the dynasty of Akhenaten, the dynasty of Hatshepsut, the dynasty of Thutmose, the first, second, and third. This is who Moses thought he was. He thought he was black. Let me just say it real plain. God says to him, what's that in the burning bush? What's that in your hand, Moses? He said, well, it's a stick. He said, throw it down. He throws it down, and what happens? Chuck, you know this story. Come on, don't.
But this is for the audience now.
It becomes a snake. And this is one of the signs of God to show to the Egyptian people, or the Mitzraymites, because they know a lot of stuff. So then God says, Moses says, that's a good sign, but I need a little bit more. So God says, put your hand inside your coat and it'll come out white. And then put it back and it'll restore its natural color. You understand? Moses thought he was a royal member of a clearly black African Kemetic dynasty. This is who he thought he was until he was a grown man. He could not have looked anything other than African in order for that reality to be a part of who he was. So Moses comes out of Kemet. So in other words, you've got, and he takes his people to the Sinai Peninsula, and to a little strip next to Egypt, next to Kemet, and Sinai Peninsula. And these people that they have to deal with and integrate with and fight with for the most of the story of the Bible are the Canaanites. Wait a minute, the sons of Ham. Remember we talked about the Hamitic curse? The racists tried to say, yeah, the Hamitic curse made you black. Ham is. You understand? Now what has happened recently over the last 40, 50 years is that when they realized that, these Hamites were in fact Kemites. And so they say, well, Hamites aren't black anymore. They're just black-skinned white people. So you see a lot of confusion in the term Hamite. But Hamites originally meant these children of Ham, the dark races. The dark races. So the Hamites are the Canaanites. The Canaanites are every other group that the Israelites interact with. Samson falls in love with this Canaanite woman. Her parents trick him. He gets pissed off. He starts jacking up people with the jawbone of an ass. You understand? The integration of Canaanites. The Philistines were Canaanites. Palestine is the Romanized word for Philistine. Okay, and it's called Palestine up until recent times. From ancient times to recent times, it was called Palestine. That's the name Philistine. Goliath was a Philistine. Philistines are Canaanites. The whole
you said it was called Philistine all that time, or
Palestine. Palestine is a Romanized word, okay, because from the Roman occupation until recently, it was called Palestine, okay, till 1949. The people are still called Palestinians. See, the names don't change, and that's one of the ways that you understand that the history is still identifying these people. The names don't change. So you got the names here, Noah's people, Noah's Ham's sons. All of these names continue on. The Cushites remain Cushites. The Mitzraymites, Egypt is still called El Misra. You see? So you see, all the names don't change. And so the Canaanites, you find the Philistines, who the Romans called Palestine. So you find David and Goliath, right? Goliath is like Shaq, man.
That's very good.
He's like Shaq. And David is like Spud Webb. So Spud Webb and Shaq are in a slam dunk contest, and Spud Webb wins. What makes you say that the ancient Hebrews, ancient Jews, were people of color? Who are they? Look at the story of the Bible. Remember, we talk about the integration of a people, intermarriage of a people. At the end of the book of Genesis, you find Joseph leading his people, bringing his family into, he's in power now, has an official position, brings his whole family from the Sinai Peninsula into Egypt. Now, his father is Jacob, who had wrestled with an angel and changed his name to Israel. And the Bible from that point becomes the story of the children of Israel. That's the family lineage that we're looking at. Okay, so he brings that whole family lineage, which at that time was 70 people, into Egypt, into Kemet, and they disappear until Jewish sources say 215, 230 years later. Some historical sources, some other sources say a few hundred years later, a couple of hundred years. They come out, And some sources say 600,000 strong. Who did they integrate with to become 600,000 people? The children of the sun of the Bible? The Mithraimites of the Bible? If they did, then these people, when they came out, were Africanized. And they, in turn, maybe not as Africanized, not as, as some of the other settlers of the region, but, I mean, look, we're picking at straws. These people were certainly Africanized. They come out with African views of religion. They come out with African traditions. What do they do when they're in the desert? They sit up there and they take off the earrings. The men take off the earrings, according to the Bible. And the women and the jewelry and the rest, and put it together and they make Hathor, the golden calf. They call it the golden. What's the golden calf? That's Hathor. You understand? That's the Kemetic nature. You see? And they do it in the Kemetic calendar. So anyway, they migrate into the Sinai and they then start to integrate and conflict with other African peoples, other dark-skinned people, Canaanites, other sons of Ham, other descendants of Ham. So the Bible is really the story of one group of people of color integrating with other groups of people of color. And what do you have to prove this? Artifacts. When you look at artifacts of Canaanites, when you look at artifacts of some of the leaders in particular of Babylon, when you look at the Phoenician artifacts, which is another Canaanite group, when you look at the Kemetic artifacts, which are the whole great legacy of Nile Valley civilization, what do you see? You see African peoples, especially during these periods in history before the larger immigrations are taking place in conjunction with some of the invasions. A really wonderful text for anybody who wants to get into the study of ancient Kemet, to understand its contributions to math, to science, to astronomy, to engineering, to architecture, to religion. I mean, religion's a whole different, ball game. When you talk about what are the roots of the religion? I mean, where did Moses grow up? Where did Jesus grow up? They grew up in Kemet in ancient Egypt. Jesus leaves ancient Israel. He leaves Bethlehem, as an infant, and doesn't show up until he's a grown man. And all this, he shows up once actually in the temple, but after that disappears again. And all this time that he shows up, where is he? He's in Egypt. He's in ancient Egypt, in Kemet. And we could talk about the Osirian resurrection, the so-called Trinity, the idea of Gnosticism. All of these things are very much a part of the legacy of this part of Africa. I'll give you an example of immigration, just to give you an example. In North Africa, you had the French from the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s onwards, begin to immigrate in large scale into Algeria in North Africa. And Algeria becomes one of the lightest complexioned African countries, not because of its original peoples, but because of immigration that takes place and how immigration has an impact. The Native Americans are not shown as the original Americans, and these Americans we have now, black or white, are not the original peoples. Immigration is what has made this. Immigration does play a part in the ancient world, but not the same kind of part it does in the modern world. So you have immigration of these ancient African peoples and peoples who have this combination cultures like the Israelis into other parts of people where people are more African. And so therefore you see the African presence throughout. Why is it that the early Christians painted images of the Black Madonna? Why is it that the early Christians painted pictures of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, as a black person? Why is it that you find icons of the apostles, icons of the early Christian activities as Africanized people? Because they were. Because they were. If the black one in Ian Begg in the Cult of the Black Virgin, talks about why the Madonnas are black, and he says when you ask the people who are worshiping the black Madonnas, why are these Madonnas black? The scholars say, well, there was paint and smoke and, years and centuries of incense burning, on these, and it makes them black. And the funny part about it is the skin is black, but the eyes are not, the fingertips are not. You understand, the teeth are not. But anyway, when he did his research, and he said, why are these black? And you know what the people would tell him? They would tell him, because they are.
Well, that sounds similar to Herodotus' first-hand account of the Egyptians, and saying that the Colchians must be black as like them. They have the black skin and woolly hair.
Yeah.
That they were referring to the land, the earth.
Oh, yeah. Some people argue that the black land, what Kemet, the Meta Nature says the black land is calling land. But in that, there's in the designate, there's a person there. So they're actually designate in the Kemet, the Meta Nature, the hieroglyphics, is really rather, plain about if it's talking about a plant, it'll show you the picture of the plant. If it's talking about a part of the body, show you a picture of the part of the body. If it's showing you a picture of a human being, then it'll show you a human being within that particular hieroglyphic.
Yeah, talk about the hieroglyphics.
I'm not an expert in hieroglyphics,
okay,
so I'm not going to talk about too much.
Not in terms of deciphering or interpreting, but are not a lot of the depictions on the Egyptian tombs and walls, or they not depict themselves as people of color?
Well, you wouldn't find this as much within the writing, because the writing becomes, over a very long period of time, very streamlined and subtle. You do find it, for example, there's a UPenn Museum here of Archaeology and Anthropology. I was just taking my class there last week. And you find from the Old Kingdom, some of the earliest images, the same glyphs that you see later, but they're really big. And the same glyph will be like really small down the road and very simplified. But in the bigger glyphs, you see people represented. These are people who are always painted brown and dark brown people as well. But you do find in the other artifacts, in the sculptures, in the tomb representations, in the upshaptis. And upshapti this isn't a real upshapti. This is a representative of one, but upshapti is a funerary figure that you'll see throughout Kemet literally by the tens of thousands. And I've never seen a single upshapti that doesn't have an African face. These were supposed to carry you and represent your family in the afterlife and things, but upshaptis.
And I'm gonna get a shot of that later on.
Okay. That's just that's not an artifact. That's just a representative. But I mean, why would they make representatives of artifacts that had black faces if the actual artifacts didn't have them? You notice in some of the movies where they appropriate Kemet, they try to make it white people as opposed to black people. On the walls, in the depictions on the walls, they show black people. You see what I'm saying? I mean, the artifacts, the monuments, the big paintings, the great sculptures do show this. There's a very strong archival representation of African peoples and African genetic leadership, throughout this particular place in Africa.
Talk a little bit about the recent computer generated
Tutankhamun.
the King Tut exhibit. Talk a little bit about what's your take on that whole thing, particularly.
It's consistent.
The visualization.
It's consistent with Egyptology. Egyptology. Shake hands to Diop says. Can I quote him for just a second?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I have a feeling. Okay. Let me just read for just a quick second a line from Sheikh Anta Diop's The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. It says, the birth of Egyptology was thus marked by the need to destroy the memory of a Negro Egypt at any cost and in all minds. Henceforth, the common denominator of all these theses of the Egyptologists can be characterized as a desperate attempt to refute that opinion. So in other words, he's saying that the birth of Egyptology was accompanied by a racist ideology that had to destroy the idea of a Negro Egypt. It says, the advent on page 51, The advent of Egyptology through the interpretation of scientific erudition is thus marked by the crude, conscious falsifications that have been marked. Now, when we take that idea and we apply the same principle to modern constructions of Egyptian identity, of ancient Egyptian identity, you see this, the whole idea of Tutankhamun. These people in Kemet were good, man. They were great artists. They were absolutely great. They knew how to depict people realistically, especially by the time you get to the 18th dynasty. You take a look at Queen Ta'i, and I'll show you, you've seen pictures of her before, and you take a look at their family and other representations. Tutankhamun's tomb had representations, had images of him, three-dimensional sculptures that show the same long head but on a black person. You see, so it's not the artifact that they're representing. It's the idea that they're going to take science and try to stretch it, to change black to white. Like Hamites. Hamites are suddenly black-skinned white people. This is crazy. Some of the arguments that were used in Egyptology to refute the Africanness or the so-called Negro-ness of Egypt, are so silly it's ridiculous. You can go to textbooks and you can find references and images where they'll show you this is a white person of South Africa or of Africa, and they're not white at all. And you say to yourself, how do they get away with this kind of stuff? And it's because the politics of knowledge. We know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know because of the politics of knowledge. Okay, we don't know the Egyptians were black because Elizabeth Taylor plays Cleopatra, and Cleopatra wasn't, jet black. She had mixed parentage. She had Greek and African parents, but still she wasn't black. I mean, she wasn't European. You understand what I'm saying? Because the Egyptians are depicted as black. The ancient world, the Bible people are depicted. I mean, I didn't want to do it, but I did anyway. I looked at Mel Gibson's the Passion of the Christ, and man, they made such a conscious attempt to not have black people in that. It was shameful. I
called it. I think it was 6.5 or 3.5. When I watched the movie, I tried to count how many black people there were. I think it was 6.5.
Even Simon the Cyrenian. Right? The guy who carried the cross for Jesus. Everybody knows, all the scholars reference that this was a black man. They got the lightest skinned black man they could find to play him. They couldn't deny he was black, but they could deny he was black. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, take a look. Have you ever seen the movie Young Guns?
No.
You sure? Of Jesse James' story and, the James boys and how they were caught. The troops that caught them, the cavalry that caught them were black. So in the movie, they actually have black soldiers there, but they're so light in complexion you can't tell. You have to look closely and say, wait a minute, was that a brother? And it was. And this is what they do. This is what happens once the academics, justify that these were Europeans, then the media, these new media, you understand? These are new media. They didn't exist before. These new media then take license to depict the whole thing like they want to depict it. And suddenly, there are no more images of black people in the Bible.
I have to share with you that my brother's a pastor, and he asked me about it. He was excited about it. And I could tell it was a family reunion type setting. It wasn't a family reunion, it was similar. And he asked me about it. We're out on the porch and everything, and all eyes were on me. And when I thought about it, and I could tell he was a little taken aback that I wasn't all that thrilled with it, because historical or academic and historical integrity are important to it. You don't want to revise history. I'm so happy that what I get from you is the facts as you know them, or as historical documentation would uphold, and not a glorified, phony, revised history that would make us feel good. History is history, good, bad, and in between. Yeah. And it was a real turnoff to me that I didn't see any African people. Because
isn't that amazing? I mean, European Jews inherit European racism. So when we talk about the images that come out in modern times and modern racist kinds of images, we see that it's all, I mean, I'm not trying to say it's a conspiracy, in part because when you think about it, if you grow up with a certain belief, that you embrace that as your belief. If it's an inaccurate belief, that's another story. But that's still your belief until you find accurate information that challenges and helps you to change that particular inaccurate belief. So we have grown up with inaccurate images of ourselves, inaccurate images of Africa, inaccurate presentations and understandings of African history, inaccurate representations of Kemet and of the Bible. So in a way, I mean, you can't fault the victim, but you have to inform the victim. You have to change that person's perspective, and to do it, we don't need to do anything except use real history.
And the victim you're alluding to is really the majority society, the people.
Yeah, not just black people.
Right. Well, let me pose this to you. I was reading Joe Fagan, the sociologist Joe Fagan, one of his books, right? White Racism, I think it was. And he had some quotes in there from H.R. Haldeman, who was one of President Nixon's, in fact, his right-hand man, one of his staff. And he had a diary where he captured some things from President Nixon. And Nixon commented he had in his diary that, Africa they're hopeless, and that African Americans, that African people have never had a high society or high civilization, that we've never really had a sustained civilization.
I mean,
it blew my mind, Daud, because this man was president of the United States, and
he went to Ghana. He was at Independence. Nixon, as vice president, was the representative who came to Ghana in 1957, March 5th, I believe, 1957, might have been March 7th, and at that time he met, and he wouldn't meet with these same people here. He met Martin Luther King in Ghana. Okay, you understand what I'm saying? This same Richard Nixon, but you're right. These people, they believe this, and they project it, but it's not true. It's just that simple. It's just simply untrue. I mean, look, okay, this is not going to be a stretch, but it's going to be a deep thought. Okay, you ready? Let me know when you're ready, brother.
Go ahead, brother. I'm ready.
Okay, this mindset that we're talking about, a Eurocentric mindset, actually convinced their own people that Africans were not human beings, even though they were having babies, having families with these human beings, with us. You understand? What kind of mindset can do that? Can have sex and babies and children and love these children, and in the same time turn around and say this isn't human? I mean, this is what people like Thomas Jefferson were doing. George Washington, and I don't normally say this, so I don't know, but I'll say it for you now. George Washington, the father of this country, only had black children. I know this for a fact because my own children are direct descendants of George Washington. In Manassas, Virginia, the Ricks family inherited a tract of land as part of their inheritance as children of George Washington in Manassas. And my children's grandparents just sold their property. They both passed recently. And their property was just sold in Manassas to make way for some of the buildings in Manassas. So, I mean, these people, what is racism? Racism makes no sense. It's not logical. It just simply is not logical. You cannot have children and families with people and then say they're not human in the same breath.
Okay, I want to shift gears on you now. Okay. You don't have to go there if you don't want to.
Okay.
But I want to talk about reparations.
Okay, good. Reparations is complicated. What do you think about it? Let me get your take on it first.
Well, I'll just stop. Okay. Yep. I'd like to ask you about reparations. do you believe that people of African descent are due reparations, and why?
Why? Well, sure, absolutely. I believe that our people have been violated, that we've been viciously
I'm
oppressed.
going to stop you right there because remember, they may not hear my question.
Okay. Oh, do I believe in reparations? And if so, why? How? Yes, I do. I believe, I know for a fact that our people have been viciously and violently oppressed. You know, a number of the reasons for the problems that we have, especially problems relating to self-esteem and economic position, have to do with factors such as intergenerational wealth transfer, which black people don't have as a matter of law. When you see, for example, in World War II, the veterans come back from World War II, and the white veterans are given the opportunity to buy houses and to get houses with a different kind of loan program than was available to black people. When you look at the inheritance of land in this country, although there are areas that black people have owned and still own large areas of land, most of the land in this country, which is available through intergenerational wealth transfer, is not available to black people. In fact, is part of the wealth inheritance that European Americans have and that Africans don't have. The main reason I think that reparations is vital is because of the violence, of the intellectual and physical violence that our people had suffered. We actually went through generations of not getting paid for back-breaking labor, and when you look at the South, when you look at the rice, we talked about Carolina rice. Well, we actually we talked about African rice and how African rice, which becomes a form of not the Asian sativa, but another type of African rice. And I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'll come back to that. When we look at that, rice goes from a few 100,000 pounds to 60 million pounds of rice every year coming out in the 1780s, 1790s, all as a product of enslaved African labor. And the way that the rice was milled in South Carolina was the African way, with the mortar and pestle. You know how you take it and you beat it and separate it from there? All of that was pure African. But the death rates, because of the numbers of many hours of mortaring and pestling, 10 hours, 8 hours a day. There's a good book that just came out recently called Black Rice that deals with this particular topic, the African rice there. The enforced labor killed people. And there was really high mortality rates for a product that was an African product that made America rich. When you look at cotton and the cotton industries, when you look at tobacco, the tobacco industries, when you look at sugar, in the Caribbean and stuff, these are what made this part of the world, these European settler colonies, rich. And the people who did the work for them were never paid. In fact, they were punished, as a compensation for this. That is wrong. That's a historical inequity that absolutely has to be redressed. Other peoples in the world have been recompensed for historical oppression. The Jews in Germany got Israel, for example. I mean, let's just be straight about that. You see that the Japanese were interred in World War II. Compensation was that. The Polish got, compensation, reparations. So reparations is a legal thing. And this country, in addition to that, it created a legal system where it was a great contradiction. On the one hand, it was the land of the free, equal protection under law, but on the other hand, it racially oppressed African peoples. And so this particular specific historic legal oppression should be and must be compensated. Now the question is, how do you compensate it? And the answer is a very complex answer. There are many, many levels in which this compensation, in which this oppression, in which reparations can take place. Some people suggest a simple cash payment for descendants of people who were enslaved. I don't think that that's really an effective way to take such a massive project under construction. Some people take an idea of the global implications of the impact of enslavement, not just on African Americans, but on Africans in all the diaspora in the Caribbean, in South America, Africans in Africa as well, where where you see this negative trade and impacting the economies, and colonial economies having similar racist policies. Apartheid in South Africa, for example, being all similar, part of the same global system of racial oppression of black peoples. And those are very different, they're miles apart in terms of what could be done. But I think that, reparations isn't going to be on the table until consciousness is in the minds of the young people and the various peoples in our culture and in our civilization. We don't have the consciousness now to empower ourselves to seek reparations as a massive group en masse. We don't have that consciousness yet. And to me, that's the first step. So I'll spend my time, working on developing tools and studies and information that helps raise historical consciousness. And once historical consciousness is raised or can be raised, then the idea and the various solutions to how reparations takes its form can really become addressed in very serious ways. Because that's something that I like to make real plain.
I know. But remember now, I'm doing a piece on the Berlin Conference.
Okay.
So even though you make some distinctions over that not being everything that has been characterized as being that they got together in 1882, 84 and carved it up and that was it, and that's where it happened. But talking about what transpired during the Berlin Conference, you understand what I'm saying? You bring a whole lot more depth to it, in terms of.
Here, you might want to take a look at this book. Take it with you.
Okay.
This is a document from the Berlin Conference.
Okay, the scramble for Africa. Okay, you ain't said nothing. All right, let me frame you up here.
All right.
But what I want you to do is just talk about the historic event of if you want to throw in the stuff about that there had a lot of transpired before then and the fierceness of the fighting of the troops and all that. That's all well and good. I want to talk about that because this is a monumental point. To me, the arrogance of the Berlin Conference is really what I want to talk about. Just the idea that somebody there wasn't one African there and that sort of thing. Go ahead, bro. Whenever you get started.
You want to talk about the Berlin Conference and
talk about the Berlin Conference. I mean, when it took place, what happened, what the results of it.
Let me contextualize that a little bit more. We often wonder what happened to the black world, or conversely, what happened to the white world, that they suddenly leaped so far ahead of other peoples in the world, right? We think about that and we say, well, what's the real reason? Most people haven't really studied it. They think that it has something to do with something in the mind or some, advantage that they naturally possess. And in reality, much of it had to do with one thing, and that is new military technology. In particular, the change in military technology that took place from the late 1860s or mid 1860s to the 1880s, which was the change from the muzzle loading technologies to the breech loading technologies. You remember, if I use this pencil, the muzzle loading, if this was a rifle, you'd stick the bullet. First you pack the powder and the explosive and the packing down in there, and then you stick the bullet and just take a stick and ram it in, and then boom, you shoot it off. Then you'd have to do the same thing every now and then. That's the muzzle loading technology. And the breech loading technology is you take the end of it off, put the bullet in there, pre-packaged bullet, put it back, bam, fire. So this particular change in technology took place primarily, like I said, from the 1860s to the 1880s. If you've ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves, you see in the beginning the Confederate sharpshooters are trying to shoot Kevin Costner and his horse from about 80 to 100 yards away, and they miss All of these sharpshooters miss with the muzzle loading technology. Bam! 3 shots in 2 minutes if you're a professional. By the end of the movie, he's giving them the new technology, which is the breech loading. He's giving the Lakota Sioux the new technology, and they're shooting the Paiutes. No, not Paiutes. They're shooting the. My mind just drew a quick blank. You have to cut this out. They're shooting their enemies. Okay, he's given the Lakota Sioux the new weapons, and they're shooting their enemies. Boom, 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 without practice, without missing. This is really pretty representative of this new technology. Between 1860 and 1880, this breech loading technology changed the nature of warfare. And in it, it changed the territorial ambitions and the mentality of many of the people who controlled this type of production. You find in the 1860s that Germany fights Prussia with these new technologies, and suddenly Germany is now a power. So we see that by the time that you get to this area, the end of the slave trade has taken place. The wealth that had characterized the enslaved, the slave owners and the slave societies has pretty much internalized their internal expansion in the Americas, both North and South America. And Europe, even though it has this new technology, doesn't have the same kind of income that it was having from those periods of time where they were deeply involved in the global slave trade. So what do? They begin to look at their military expansion in the areas they could not have expanded into prior to this new technology. We talked about Africans having horses. People don't know about the Africans had guns too. We have this image that Africans didn't have guns and the Europeans. That's a fabrication, of the media. If we look at East Africa, or if we look at West Africa, we see that the gun trade accompanied the slave trade, and that many African states had thousands of guns. We also find that in the North-South trade, the trans-Saharan trade, that guns were an important part of the trade. Gunpowder was made by African peoples. Guns were manufactured within Africa by African peoples. Africans had guns by the thousands. This is a myth that we think Africans didn't have guns and Europeans, and it's just a way to dumbify us and make us think the simple thing is really what happened. In reality, it was much, much more complex. So that by the time that you get to the Berlin Conference, there had been several campaigns, major campaigns in Africa that tested the types of weaponry against African forces and against African fighting conditions. So that you find, it's interesting, some of the Americans that became central in the whole idea, the whole interest in Africa, Henry Stanley, British, and the rest become a part of this too. So you had in 1868, 66,000 British troops land in the coast of Ethiopia to try to rescue hostages in Ethiopia. They barely make it through there because the Ethiopian emperor Tewodros is very unpopular. The other Ethiopians leave them through, and they end up fighting in there. 1874, you find the invasion of Kumasi, and the Europeans try to bring a force into a West African powerhouse, and they ultimately make it, but they start out with 25,000 troops, and they end up with only with 1,500 troops being killed. And the Asante was so slick that they would wake up in the morning, the British would wake up, and the Asante would be inside of the camp. You understand what I'm saying? They just barely made this out. And what happened was they, in a document that they had for their troops in 1874, this is 20 years before the Berlin Conference, 10 years before the Berlin Conference. They say, our new breech loading weapons are far superior to their old flintlocks and their old muskets, which are only accurate up to 60, 70 yards at the most. So the new technology is starting to be a justification for expansion that didn't exist before, because they couldn't beat the African cavalries before. They couldn't beat cavalries of 6, 7, 10, 15,000 cavalry because they didn't have the weaponry to do it until that time. So you find that during this period, from the 1860s to the 1880s, is where you have the territorial expansion of Europe. Gunboats on the Yangtze River in China, the penetration of some of the rivers in Africa, and the colonial penetration begins in the 1800s there when you have Leopold and the gunboats on the Congo River. And you see that when these new weapons show up, African rulers see these new weapons, and rather than kowtow to them, the Europeans say, let us be your allies. We have these new weapons. And so the whole phase after the Berlin Conference in 1884 was called the diplomatic phase, that for at least 7 to 10 years, the efforts were to try to make treaties with these African powers. And then once these treaties were made and they were entrenched, and they began recruiting more black troops. And that's the subject I don't know if we can talk about right now. We should spend a whole session, if you will, on black troops. But that whole process becomes solidified, where you have, now you're in, and you have more troops, and you have better weapons. Then you can start to try to actually seize territories that you at first had claimed only as spheres of influence. Mm-hmm. And this is what the conference, to me, was about.
We got about 2.5 minutes left on this tape.
2 tapes, huh?
And that's all right. I got another one. I came ready, brother. I didn't expect it, but it's all right. We're going to do this again.
Okay.
But what I want you to talk about is what transpired during the conference, and the principles that were there, and how the continent was carved up. I was carved up irrespective of natural.
No, I have to disagree.
Right.
The continent was not carved up in the Congress of Berlin. What happened was that the coastal areas, and remember, this is a almost 12 million square mile continent. Okay. They didn't know anything or hardly anything about what was going on the interior of the continent at the time. Okay. But what they did was that the coastal areas, in which there was European trading interest and some knowledge of what was in the interior, they protected each other's interests. They created spheres of influence, whereby the Portuguese said, we want to trade up this river and with these people. The British would say, we want to trade here, and they would negotiate, the trading rights in those regions. Similar to how the British and French and Spanish considered themselves to have areas of North America that they had no knowledge of in 1600s, and only in the 1800s that they got into these areas with the Louisiana Purchase and stuff like that. Very similar. So it wasn't about the carving of. What resulted after a period of 20 years of warfare was the carving up into these various territories. But it's that 20 years of warfare that decided the carving up, not the Conference of Berlin. Okay.
So that's a very important. Talk about the great Egyptian physician and architect Imhotep.
Imhotep is a figure that I'd like to study a little more because he had such a profound impact on the idea of what is a scientist, what is a thinker. You see, Imhotep was a quintessential scientist. Not only was he the architect of the first massive stone building in history, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, but he also cataloged thousands of medicinal uses of plants. He didn't just sit and list plants. He said, this plant is used to help cure this. So you put this plant on your eye if your bee stings you on your eye. You take this plant, put it on an open wound, if this wound is taken. You pick this plant if you're suffering from indigestion. You take this. 3,000 medicinal uses of plants. And the most famous saying that he has until this day, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die.